Hey everyone, this is Tony here from Psycho Candy. In this video, I'm going to go over what I deem to be a very good example of an INFP from the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. And in this analysis, we're going to be examining the famous author slash poet Sylvia Plath. Now, unfortunately, because of the age of this recording, there's no video to go along with it, and you might hear some cracks and pops from the LP. So just try to bear through that. The interview itself is very good. I believe it was recorded in 1962, just a year before her death. And you should also know that I've made some cuts and edits to the interview just for the sake of this video. So if you'd like to listen to the unedited version, you can find the source in the description below. So without further ado, let's get started.
I don't know what started me. I just wrote it from the time I was quite small. I guess I liked nursery rhymes, and I guess I thought I could sort of do the same thing. I wrote my first poem, my first published poem when I was 8 and a half. It came out in the Boston Traveler. And from then on, I suppose I've been a bit of a professional.
What sort of things did you write about when you began writing poetry?
Nature, I think. Birds, bees, spring, fall, all those subjects which are absolute gifts to the person who doesn't have, sort of any interior experiences to write about. I think that the coming of spring, the stars overhead, first snowfall and so on are gifts for a child, a young poet.
Okay, so even from a young age, we can see a deep connection towards self-identity and expression of the self, which is very common with INFPs even early on. And as she mentions this interior experience, we can already see the introverted feeling, first slot FI, begin to come through, and how she used poetry as an outlet for that. In this next clip, try to pay attention to how she talks about her experiences and how she wants to connect with them on an emotional level.
My poems come immediately out of the sensuous and emotional experiences I have, but I must say I cannot sympathize with these cries from the heart that are informed by nothing except, a needle or a knife or whatever it is. I believe that one should be able to control and manipulate experiences, even the most terrifying, like madness, being tortured, this sort of experience. That one should be able to manipulate these experiences with an informed and intelligent mind. I think that personal experience is very important, but certainly it shouldn't be a kind of shut box and sort of mirror-looking narcissistic experience. I believe it should be relevant, and relevant to the larger things, the bigger things, such as Hiroshima and Dachau and so on.
So behind the primitive emotional reaction, there must be an intellectual discipline.
I feel that very strongly. Having been an academic, having been tempted by the invitation to stay on, to become a PhD, a professor and all that, one side of me certainly does respect all disciplines, as long as they don't ossify.
I really like the closing statement of that clip because it represents the FITE axis so well. And for those of you who might not know what that means, it's basically that she respected discipline, hard work, and structure, but not to the point where it would constrict or bind creativity. So what I've noticed is that a lot of times INFPs will find themselves in conflict between true expression of self versus getting labeled or put into boxes. This next clip is a good example of that.
Well, now, you're talking to me as a general American. Well, in particular, my background is, may I say, German and Austrian. On one side, I'm a first-generation American. On one side, I'm a second-generation American. And so my concern, I must say, with concentration camps and so on is uniquely intense. And then again, I'm rather a political person as well. So I suppose that's what part of it comes from. Perhaps this is an American thing. I've been very excited by what I feel is the new breakthrough that came with, say, Robert Lowell's life studies, this intense breakthrough into very serious, very personal, emotional experience, which I feel has been partly taboo. Robert Lowell's poems about his experiences in a mental hospital, for example, interest me very much. These peculiar, private, and taboo subjects I feel have been explored in recent American poetry. I think particularly of the poetess Anne Sexton, who writes also about her experiences as a mother who's had a nervous breakdown, as an extremely emotional and feeling young woman. And her poems are wonderfully craftsmanlike poems, and yet they have a kind of emotional and psychological depth, which I think is something perhaps quite new, quite exciting.
So I don't want to sound like a broken record here because there are just so many examples of introverted feeling in this interview that it becomes almost impossible to ignore or talk about, especially when I'm doing an analysis on INFPs. So going back to INFPs in general, something that they usually have to deal with that I've noticed is the battle of being authentic and genuine to themselves and their own feelings and emotions, and facing criticism of others when they don't agree with them. So here's how Sylvia dealt with that.
Oh, I know when I was at Cambridge, this appeared to me. Young women would come up to me and say, how do you dare to write? How do you dare to publish a poem? Because of the criticism, the terrible criticism that falls upon one if one does publish. And the criticism is not, of the poem as poem. I remember being appalled when someone criticized me for beginning just like John Donne, but not quite managing to finish like John Donne. And I felt the weight of English literature on me at that point. And I think the whole emphasis in England, in the university, on practical criticism, but not that so much as historical criticism, knowing what period a line comes from. This is almost paralyzing. In America, at university, we read what? T.S. Eliot, Dylan Thomas, Yeats. That's where we began. Shakespeare floated in the background. I'm not sure I agree with this, but I think that for the young poet, the writing poet, it's not quite so frightening to go to university in America as it is in England, for these reasons.
Okay, guys, so there's obviously a lot more to INFPs than just introverted feeling. So for the sake of time, I have to try and keep this video a bit more basic. But what I can say is that as people get older, no matter what type you are, the other functions will start to develop more and more, and you will get better at them. So try to keep that in mind as you hear these last two clips, and try to see what I'm getting at here.
I'm not a historian, but I find myself being more and more fascinated by history. And now I find myself reading more and more about history. I'm very interested in Napoleon at the present. I'm very interested in battles, in wars, in Gallipoli, or, the First World War and so on. And I think that as I age, I'm becoming more and more historical. I certainly wasn't at all in my early 20s. I much prefer doctors, midwives, lawyers, anything but writers. I think writers and artists are the most narcissistic people. I mustn't say this. I like many of them. In fact, a great many of my friends happen to be writers and artists. But I must say, what I admire most, or I certainly find myself looking toward, is the person who masters an area of practical experience and can teach me something. I mean, my local midwife has taught me how to keep bees. Well, she can't understand anything I write. And I find myself liking her, may I say, more than most poets. And among my friends, I find these people who know all about boats, or know about a certain sport, or know about how to cut somebody open and remove an organ. Well, I'm fascinated by this mastery of the practical. And I must say, I feel as a poet, one lives a bit on air, and I always like someone who can teach me something practical.
So I'm going to conclude this video for now. I really hope you found it helpful and resourceful. If you did, feel free to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more. If you yourself are an INFP, I definitely recommend checking out the full interview in the description below. And yeah, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.